little bit in just a few minutes some of the powerful quotes from that documentary that I really think addresses that question in a more eloquent and beautiful way than I can. But one of the things that happened on Friday evening is I discovered in our discussion afterwards that Dimitri was involved in the building of the Twin Towers, and he worked there for 10 years. And he has written a tribute in regards to the events of 9/11 that he's going to share with you now.
This is kind of a personal observations about what is the nature of evil, because that's the word that we hear most associated with this event. The year was 1969. I was a young engineer fresh out of City College in New York with a degree in civil engineering when I joined the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. My first assignment was deep down in a 40-acre hole, 85 feet deep at the very southern tip of Manhattan Island. We were putting in the foundations for the World Trade Center. I was excited and so proud to be a part of this dramatic, powerful overstatement of a building, really. And I kind of snickered to myself at the gross over-design of the structure. Every column was continuously welded steel from the grouted pocket in the bedrock of Manhattan all the way to the top, a quarter of a mile up. The columns were only 30 inches apart all the way around the four sides of the square tower. It was designed to withstand hurricanes of 200 miles an hour and crashes of Boeing 707s. That was in the original design. It was a statement of superlatives: strength, power, and maybe a bit of arrogance. Also, it was over budget and almost 2 years past due. But the Twin Towers quickly became an icon, world-renowned, loved and hated. A new skyline for sure. I was working out of my home office on September 11th in 2001 when Iris came rushing into the house with panic. They were attacking the World Trade Center. And we watched in horror as that second plane slammed into tower number 2. And the flames shot out explosive plumes on the opposite side of the building and bodies plunged to the ground. We were sickened at the sight, and we cried together. I recall those years when I proudly rode up to the 98th floor to work every day and marveled at that spectacular view of New York Harbor. Now, thousands of innocent people were dead, dying, or trapped in a burning inferno. And then we saw each tower in its turn collapse into a pile of rubble, creating an appearance of a nuclear winter for blocks all around. Surely this was the most evil deed anyone could imagine. And everyone said it. This is the face of evil. But to me, evil is a separation. It's the lack of empathy. It's really pretty simple. It's not about religion or right or wrong or Hitler or Mother Teresa. It's just the lack of empathy. Of course, Hitler empathized with no one except for his personal Aryan ideal. And Mother Teresa found empathy in her heart for every unfortunate soul she met. Anytime I'm so focused on my own agenda that I cannot hear the cries of other human beings, when I have no empathy for their plight, that is the nature of evil. And surely those fanatics that so prize their own goals to the utter disregard of thousands of innocent lives, they were evil. They sacrificed others just to get the world's attention to their own agenda. They cared nothing and empathized nothing for those innocents that were caught in their web. In the late 1950s, the Port Authority had an idea, a grand agenda of theirs. Let's create a World Trade Center that will accommodate in one single location all the activities that work in world trade. This would be a project for the common good, unlike a typical commercial development. And so to that end, they used their powers of eminent domain for the greater good to condemn hundreds of small businesses and thousands of residential properties throughout Lower Manhattan. It took almost 10 years to put together 20 acres that were required for that World Trade Center site. Many of those dislocated folks, they fought their fate, they begged in the courts to keep their little tracts of heaven, but they had no power against the political might of the Port Authority. And the Port Authority did not empathize with the disenfranchised. They had their own agenda and dream. The World Trade Center had construction cost overruns, like most of these big projects. The bill was ultimately $500 million back then. It almost bankrupted the Port Authority. Their response? An overnight doubling of all the tolls on the New York, New Jersey bridges and tunnels. Just in the nick of time, the money poured in. But the AAA saw this as an abuse of power in administering public transportation facilities, and they sued in federal court. In fact, the Bridge Act of 1920 specifically forbids any authority from charging more than what it costs to pay for their bonds and the cost of maintenance on bridges. But the courts, regardless of the law, of that specific law, sided with the power structure. They said the greater public good was served, and they allowed the increase in tolls. The dream continued. The motorist, just another minor inconvenience. When the shiny new buildings were done, lo and behold, the Port Authority found that they couldn't find half enough World Trade operators to reside in these towers. They sat half empty. But the residents that had lost their shops and offices weren't eligible to rent in the buildings. And in fact, there was a glut of office space in New York during the mid-70s. Competitors were finding the market oversupplied, and the losses really mounted. The governor of New York, however, was not to be denied. He'd been a champion of this project from day one. He personally ordered all the state workers, wherever they had been in buildings all throughout the city, to immediately relocate to the Twin Towers and fill them up. The other landowners were appalled. The state was not even seeking competitive bids, just using executive privilege at the highest level to relocate thousands of civil service workers, inconveniencing most and totally uncaring of the consequences to bolster the World Trade Center success. Again, this was challenged in Part 2. These people were not world traders. They were the Motor Vehicle Bureau and other offices like that. But the courts, again, sided with the power structure and allowed the relocation. Then in the environmental 1970s came the realization that asbestos was a potent carcinogen. You probably remember that. Spray-on asbestos insulation used for fireproofing steel structures was suddenly prohibited by every building code. Not only was asbestos a carcinogen, but it also tended to flake off over time, becoming airborne and contaminating the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems of all these major buildings. It also proved to be unreliable as fireproofing for the same reason, because it flaked off. New buildings were now using concrete to encapsulate steel and to give it a fire rating, but of course the World Trade Center had totally used asbestos throughout in all their structures. The Port Authority evaluated these new building codes and did some studies. They found that the cost of remediating the asbestos was going to be $200 million. Private enterprise had no choice. They were mandated to upgrade their fire protection. But building codes don't apply to government agencies. The Port Authority decided to empathize, could decide to empathize with the 100,000 people that were in the buildings every day and protect the air they breathe and ensure their fire protection. They elected not to. they elected to shelve the studies, put them back in their folders, and tell no one about it. They were self-insured, and they were self-assured that the losses were going to be tolerable as a business. In business, you hear about top executives making those tough decisions. These are the kind of tough decisions they make every day. I will take the risk of this potential financial exposure. You don't hear them saying, I empathize with the people affected by my actions, and I will do the right thing. Well, guess what? Remember when I told you the World Trade Center was massively overbuilt? All those continuously welded steel columns? Unfortunately, to keep those massive columns perfectly vertical, engineers relied on the floor joist and one single large bolt that connected every joint to every column at every floor. When those airplanes ran into the towers withstood the force almost without flinching, but the asbestos fire protection dropped off the steel in great big chunks, and those naked bolts could not withstand the heat of all that jet fuel burning. As they melted, the massive columns now become unstable. They bowed out ever so slightly, and with the weight of the 110 stories above, the whole structure collapsed. Kind of for the lack of a horseshoe nail, a kingdom was lost. For the lack of a little of the right fire protection, on the steel buildings came tumbling down. So the flagrant exercise of power, ignoring the details. Why do we prize arrogant leaders that incidentally crush the details in our haste to realize the big dream? Is it just being focused, or is that the nature of evil?